The millionaire let his niece choose his bride. He froze when she pointed at the nanny. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. The Hale mansion gleamed under the soft evening lights. Laughter echoed through its marble halls as guests in elegant dresses raised their glasses to celebrate little Lily's 7th birthday. Balloons floated between crystal chandeliers and the scent of vanilla cake filled the air. At the center of it all stood Ethan Hale, the quiet billionaire everyone in New York talked about but rarely saw smile. His tailored suit fit perfectly, but his eyes carried a distance that not even champagne or money could blur. Uncle Ethan, Lily chirped, tugging at his sleeve. You said, "If I could make one birthday wish, you would make it come true, right?" Ethan smiled faintly, lowering himself to her height. "Of course, sweetheart. What is your wish?" Lily grinned mischievously. "I want to pick your bride." The room burst into laughter. Even the house staff exchanged amused glances. Ethan, who had been dodging every conversation about marriage for years, chuckled. "All right then. If you can find someone who makes me smile, I will marry her." No one expected what happened next. Lily looked around the room, scanning every elegant woman in shimmering gowns, then stopped. Her tiny finger pointed toward the corner where Grace, the young nanny, stood, holding a tray of cupcakes, her cheeks flushed from embarrassment. The laughter faded. Ethan froze. For a heartbeat, the entire room went silent. Grace blinked, unsure if she had done something wrong. "Me," she whispered, clutching the tray tighter. Lily nodded proudly. "Yes. She makes you smile more than anyone else." Ethan's lips parted, but no words came out. His friends watched in disbelief. Somewhere behind him, the pianist hit a wrong note. He forced a small laugh, trying to dismiss the tension, but his gaze lingered on Grace a moment too long. Grace quickly turned away, pretending to adjust the candles on the cake, her heart pounding in her chest. She was used to being invisible in this house, a helper, a caretaker, someone hired to keep Lily safe while staying out of her employer's way. But tonight, under the golden glow of the chandelier, every eye was on her. Ethan took a sip of his drink, trying to appear unfazed, yet something inside him shifted. The innocence in Lily's choice struck a chord he did not know still existed. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to look away from someone, not because of beauty or charm, but because she seemed real. Grace could feel his gaze. She kept her eyes down, murmuring, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," and handed Lily the first slice of cake. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained gentle, steady. Across the room, Ethan exhaled slowly. He should have laughed it off, should have turned the moment into another polite joke. But he could not. Something about the way Grace's eyes softened when she looked at Lily, something about the calmness in her posture, it made him wonder when he had last seen such quiet strength. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees of the estate, carrying the distant hum of city lights. Inside, the party resumed, yet Ethan's world did not. He watched as Grace disappeared toward the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of candles. The sound of her voice lingered like a whisper in his mind, and for reasons he could not explain, the man who had everything suddenly felt like he was missing something he had never known he needed. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Hale mansion, cutting across the white marble floor like golden ribbons. The party was over, but the awkward moment from last night still lingered in Ethan's mind. He sat in his study, a cup of untouched black coffee cooling beside the morning newspaper. His assistant Daniel stood by the door, reading through the day's agenda. "Sir, your 9 o'clock meeting with the board," Daniel began, but Ethan lifted a hand, stopping him. "Cancel it," he said quietly. Daniel blinked. "Cancel, sir?" Ethan looked out the window toward the garden where Grace was helping Lily water the roses. The child's laughter floated through the open glass doors. Grace knelt beside her, sleeves, rolled up hair tied in a simple bun, sunlight brushing her cheek. There was nothing remarkable about her clothes or jewelry, yet there was something disarming in her calmness. "Yes. Cancel everything before noon," Ethan said, his voice softer this time. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Ethan watched as Lily playfully splashed water on Grace, who squealed and laughed a sound that caught him off guard. He had not heard that kind of laughter in his home for years. not since his sister's passing when Lily became his responsibility. Later that afternoon, Grace was in the kitchen sorting groceries when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, nearly dropping a bag of apples. "Mr. Hale," she said, startled. "I am sorry, I did not know you were here." Ethan gave a small, polite smile. "It is fine. I was just passing through." Grace nodded, nervous. "Do you need anything, sir?" He shook his head. "No. I was wondering, how long have you been working here?" "Almost 8 months," she said, placing the apples neatly into a bowl. "I took the job after my mother's surgery. It has been steady work." Ethan's gaze softened. "Lily seems very fond of you." Grace smiled faintly. "She is a special girl. She misses having someone to talk to about her drawings. Sometimes she says she wishes her parents were still alive." Ethan's throat tightened. "She never says that to me," he murmured. Grace lowered her eyes. "Children often hide their sadness to protect the people they love." The words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not awkward, it was heavy, fragile. Ethan cleared his throat. "Would you join us for lunch today? Lily has been asking for it." Grace hesitated. "I would not want to intrude, sir." "You would not," he said, almost too quickly. "It would make her happy." That afternoon they ate together on the patio overlooking the garden. Lily chattered endlessly about her favorite fairy tales while Grace listened, occasionally glancing at Ethan with polite restraint. When Lily excused herself to feed her rabbits, Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying the woman across from him. "You were very calm last night," he said suddenly. "Most people would have panicked being the center of attention like that." Grace laughed softly. "I wanted to, but it was Lily's moment, not mine. Children say what they feel. I could not scold her for being honest." Ethan found himself smiling, really smiling for the first time in months. Grace noticed, though she pretended not to. After lunch, she excused herself to take Lily for her nap. As she walked away, Ethan caught sight of something slipping from her pocket, a folded piece of paper. He picked it up. It was a child's drawing, 3 figures holding hands in a garden. In crayon letters it read, "My Dream Family." He froze. The same drawing from last night. That evening he stood alone in his study, the paper spread out on his desk. He stared at it until the lines blurred. For years his life had been perfectly arranged meetings, investments, charity galas, and polite smiles. But this simple drawing made by a child was unraveling all of it. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. Through the glass door he could see the faint light from the nanny's quarters. For reasons he could not name, Ethan walked to the balcony, the night air cool against his face. Below, Grace's shadow moved behind the curtain as she tucked Lily into bed. He could hear Lily's soft voice through the open window. "Grace, do you think Uncle Ethan is lonely?" Grace's answer floated up like a whisper. "Maybe. But sometimes people forget how to be happy. They just need a reason to remember." Ethan closed his eyes, the words settling deep within him. For the first time in years, the silence of his mansion felt less like emptiness and more like the beginning of something he did not yet understand. 2 days later, the morning sky over the Hale mansion was pale blue, painted with streaks of soft clouds. The world felt strangely lighter to Ethan, though he could not explain why. His usual routine, early meetings, phone calls, constant noise, suddenly felt less urgent. He found himself lingering longer at breakfast, watching Lily draw at the table while Grace poured orange juice beside her. Lily looked up with a proud grin. "Uncle Ethan, look, it is you, me and Grace at the park." Ethan leaned closer. The crayon figures were smiling beneath a tree. "You even gave me hair," he said with a small chuckle. Grace laughed softly. "She insists on making you younger every time she draws." Ethan smiled, and for a moment the air between them was easy warm. Then his phone rang. The tone shattered the softness. He hesitated before answering. It was Daniel, his assistant. "Sir, the investors from Boston are here early. They want to meet before lunch." Ethan glanced at Lily's hopeful face, then at Grace, who quietly lowered her gaze. "Tell them I will be there in an hour," he said finally. When he left, Grace gathered the dishes. She hummed softly, unaware that her voice carried through the hall like a thread of calm. The staff paused to listen, smiling quietly. For a house once filled with silence, it felt alive again. Later that day, Grace took Lily to the community park near the mansion. The air smelled of rain, and the pond reflected the gray sky. Lily ran ahead, chasing a group of ducks, her laughter echoing through the quiet. Grace sat on a bench, her sketchbook resting on her lap. She loved drawing when the world slowed down. She did not notice Ethan's car pull up by the path. He stepped out still in his black suit and saw her sitting there, barefoot, hair slightly windblown, completely unaware of his presence. For a moment he simply watched. There was no need for words. The scene itself spoke louder than anything he could say. He approached quietly. "You draw?" Grace turned, startled. "Mr. Hale, yes, just for Lily. It helps her talk about what she feels." Ethan sat beside her, his hands folded. "What about you? Does it help you too?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe. It reminds me of my mother. She used to draw when she was sick. It made her believe that better days were coming." He looked at her for a long moment, the sincerity in her voice disarming him. "You know," he said softly, "I have spent half my life building things, companies, projects, numbers. But I have no idea how to build something that lasts." Grace tilted her head. "Maybe it is not about building, sir. Maybe it is about caring for what you already have." Her words hung in the cool air. Ethan nodded slowly, as if the thought had never occurred to him. When they returned to the mansion, Lily was already asleep in the back seat. Grace carried her inside, careful not to wake her. Ethan followed silently, watching the tenderness with which she tucked the child into bed. She brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, then whispered, "Good night, sunshine." Ethan lingered by the door. "You have a gift with her," he said quietly. Grace turned. "Children see the world in simple ways. They just want someone who listens." That night, Ethan found himself sitting in his office with the sketchbook Grace had left behind. On one of the pages was a half-finished drawing, Lily between two adults holding her hands. The man's face was not yet drawn. Only a faint outline waited to be filled. He stared at it for a long time. The silence of his study felt different, no longer hollow but alive with questions he had never dared to ask. Across the house, the light from Grace's room flickered off. Ethan leaned back, closing the sketchbook carefully. For years he had believed that control was strength, that emotion was a distraction. But now, as the night deepened around him, he began to realize that perhaps the truest strength was allowing himself to feel again. He looked toward the hallway that led to Lily's room, and for the first time he whispered a quiet thank you to the little girl who had pointed at the nanny and unknowingly had pointed him back toward life. The following week, the air around the Hale mansion felt brighter. Spring sunlight touched the gardens and the scent of roses drifted through open windows. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself spending less time in his office and more time in the garden with Lily and Grace. What began as short conversations turned into long afternoons filled with laughter and quiet discoveries. One afternoon, Lily ran across the yard holding a handful of wildflowers. "Uncle Ethan," Grace said, "we can press these into my sketchbook." Ethan looked up from his laptop, amused. "Did she? I suppose that means my meeting is over." He closed the computer and followed Lily toward the gazebo where Grace sat with scissors and a notebook. She smiled politely when he approached. "We were just finishing Lily's art project." Ethan sat down across from her. "You seem to turn everything into art." Grace blushed slightly. "Maybe because art makes even the ordinary look meaningful." He leaned back, watching her carefully place the flowers between sheets of parchment. "I used to think business was the only way to leave a mark," he said. "Now I am not so sure." Grace looked up. "Sometimes the smallest kindness leaves the biggest mark." Their eyes met for a moment that lingered too long. Lily giggled, oblivious to the tension between them. She held up the book proudly. "See now, the flowers can last forever." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Ethan found himself pacing his study. His reflection in the window seemed unfamiliar. A man who no longer looked like a stranger in his own home. He could hear Grace's laughter drifting faintly from the kitchen, mixing with Lily's voice. It felt like a melody he never knew he had missed. The next morning, Ethan's sister-in-law Margaret arrived unexpectedly. She was Lily's aunt from her mother's side, elegant and sharp-eyed. She noticed the change in the house immediately, the warmth, the laughter, and the way Ethan seemed lighter. "So this is the famous Nanny," she said, when Grace entered with tea. Grace froze slightly, but smiled. "Good morning, ma'am." Margaret examined her with cool curiosity. "Lily seems very attached to you. Quite the accomplishment." "Lily is an easy child to love," Grace replied gently. Ethan sensed the tension and stepped in. "Margaret, Grace has been doing an excellent job. I do not know what we would do without her." Margaret's lips curved faintly, but her tone carried warning. "Just be careful, Ethan. The staff should know their place." Grace excused herself quietly, but her heart ached. She understood her place perfectly well, yet for the first time she wished she did not. That night, Lily refused to sleep without Grace's bedtime story. Grace sat beside the bed reading softly, her voice wrapping around the room like a lullaby. Ethan stood by the door watching them. When the story ended, Lily whispered, "Grace, promise you will not ever leave." Grace brushed her hair gently. "I promise, as long as you need me." When Grace turned, she saw Ethan still standing there. Their eyes met in the dim light. He spoke quietly, almost hesitant. "What you said earlier about art and kindness, it has been on my mind." Grace smiled softly. "You should try it sometime, Mr. Hale." "I think I already am," he said, his voice low, sincere. The moment stretched between them, fragile and real. She lowered her gaze, heart pounding, and stepped past him to leave. Ethan remained where he stood, his pulse unsteady, realizing that something inside him had shifted far beyond simple admiration. Down the hall he could still hear Grace's footsteps fading away. He exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against the sketchbook Lily had left on the table. On the latest page, a new drawing appeared, 3 figures again, but this time the man's face was clear. It was his own. Ethan closed the book gently, his chest tightening with a strange mix of hope and fear. For the first time, the billionaire who thought he could control everything found himself standing at the edge of something he could not define, something fragile, human, and dangerously close to love. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm. Spring turned into early summer, and the Hale mansion felt alive in a way no one had seen in years. Ethan had begun joining Grace and Lily for breakfast each morning, a small change that made the house warmer. Grace noticed it too, but tried not to let it show. Every time she caught him watching her, she would busy herself with chores, pretending not to feel her heart stumble. One Friday afternoon, Ethan invited Grace and Lily to accompany him to the Home Haven Project, a new foundation he was building to provide housing for children in need. Grace hesitated at first, unsure if it was proper, but Lily's excitement left her no room to refuse. The drive into the city was filled with laughter. Lily sat in the back seat singing softly while Grace admired the skyline flashing by the window. "You are really doing something good here, Mr. Hale," she said. "Home Haven sounds like a place that matters." Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "It was just an idea until you said children should design their own rooms. That changed everything." Grace looked surprised. "You remembered that I remember most of what you say," he answered almost too quietly. The car fell silent after that, but it was a silence that felt full, like words they were not ready to speak. At the construction site, Ethan guided them through the nearly finished building. Workers nodded respectfully as he passed, but his attention stayed on Grace and Lily. He watched the way Grace knelt to listen to a young boy describing his dream bedroom, how she encouraged him to draw it out on a scrap of paper. Her kindness felt effortless, genuine. When they reached the rooftop garden, the afternoon light poured over them like honey. Lily ran ahead, chasing butterflies between potted plants. Ethan stood beside Grace, the city stretching endlessly below them. "You were right," he said softly, "about caring for what you already have. I used to think success was about control, but now I see that it is about connection." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe both, but connection is what keeps everything alive." Their hands brushed as they leaned on the railing. Neither moved away. The moment was simple, yet it carried more meaning than any grand gesture could. Just then Lily called out from across the garden, "Uncle Ethan, come see. I found a butterfly with 2 colors." Ethan laughed, a sound so pure and unguarded that Grace froze, realizing it was the first time she had heard him laugh freely. He walked over to Lily, kneeling beside her, as she showed him the tiny creature resting on her hand. Grace watched from a distance, smiling to herself. That evening, after they returned home, Grace stood by the window of the guest cottage, watching the lights from the mansion glow softly against the dark. Inside, she could still hear faint laughter from Ethan and Lily's late-night stories. A quiet warmth spread through her chest. But she also knew that warmth was dangerous. She was a nanny, an employee. Sooner or later, she would have to leave. Feelings like this had no place in the life she had built carefully around responsibility and boundaries. She closed the curtains and whispered to herself, "Do not forget who you are, Grace." At that same hour in the main house, Ethan sat alone in his study, unable to focus on the paperwork in front of him. His thoughts drifted to her, the way she smiled, the way she listened. He picked up the sketchbook Lily had left on the table and traced the outline of Grace's drawn figure with his fingertip. He exhaled slowly and whispered, "Maybe I finally found the reason to remember." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the sound of the city far away. Inside, two hearts in different rooms beat quietly, unsure of what came next, yet drawn toward the same unspoken truth neither dared to name. A week later, the Hale mansion was preparing for the charity gala that would officially launch the Home Haven Foundation. The grand ballroom shimmered with gold and ivory decorations, a reflection of Ethan's refined taste. For everyone in attendance, it was another society event. For Ethan, it felt like a new beginning. Grace had been asked to help Lily get ready for the evening, and she spent the late afternoon fixing the child's hair into soft curls. Lily twirled in her pale blue dress, eyes sparkling. "Do you think Uncle Ethan will like it?" Grace smiled. "He will love it, sweetheart. You look perfect." When they entered the ballroom, guests turned to admire Lily's sweetness and the calm presence of the nanny who walked beside her. Ethan stood near the stage, speaking with donors, but when his eyes caught Grace across the room, something inside him stilled. She was not dressed like the other women in sequins or diamonds. She wore a simple cream dress, modest yet graceful, and somehow she looked more radiant than anyone there. He excused himself from the conversation and approached them. "You both look beautiful," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace dipped her head slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. It is a lovely event." "Ethan," he corrected quietly. "Tonight, just Ethan." Before she could respond, the host's voice echoed through the microphone, inviting everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome Mr. Ethan Hale, founder of the Home Haven Foundation." Applause filled the room as Ethan stepped onto the stage. Grace stood near the corner with Lily, watching him speak with quiet pride. His words were simple but heartfelt. He talked about giving children safety, hope, and the chance to belong. Then, as the slideshow began to play behind him, the first image on the screen froze her in place. It was Lily's drawing, the one Grace had helped her finish. The crayon figures of a man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands under a garden tree. The caption read, "My Dream Family." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed. Grace's heart stopped. Ethan turned, realizing what had appeared, but it was too late. The next slide showed photos of Lily, Grace, and Ethan together, moments captured unknowingly around the house and project site. The crowd murmured, whispering. Margaret's voice sliced through the whispers. "So this is what has been going on." The nanny, as the new Mrs. Hale, Grace's face went pale. She shook her head. "No, that is not." But her voice drowned under the rising noise. Ethan tried to calm the crowd, but the damage was done. Lily clung to Grace's leg, frightened by the sudden chaos. Ethan finally took the microphone again. "Please, everyone, that was not meant to be shown tonight. It was a personal drawing." The explanation sounded hollow in the buzz of gossip. Grace's throat tightened. She could feel every eye on her, some judging, some pitying. She whispered to Lily, "Let us go, sweetheart." Without waiting for permission, she turned and guided the child out of the ballroom. Ethan started to follow, but reporters surrounded him. Flashbulbs burst like lightning. His name echoed with questions about scandal and impropriety. By the time he reached the hallway, Grace was gone. Outside, the night air was sharp, filled with the sound of her quick footsteps fading down the stone path. Lily's drawing had been meant to celebrate love and family, but now it had exposed the very truth Grace had tried to hide, the invisible line she was never meant to cross. Back inside the ballroom, Ethan stood frozen on the empty stage, her absence louder than the noise around him. For the first time in his life, the man who owned everything realized what it truly meant to lose something that mattered. The night after the gala, the Hale mansion felt colder than it had in years. The laughter that once filled its halls was gone, replaced by silence that even the ticking clock could not break. Ethan stood in his study, the lights dim, the remnants of the event still haunting him. The image of Grace's pale face as she walked out played over and over in his mind. He had spent the day answering questions from the press, deflecting rumors, and assuring the foundation's donors that everything was under control. But nothing felt under control. Lily refused to eat dinner and cried herself to sleep, clutching the crayon drawing that had caused it all. Ethan stared at the same drawing, now the paper slightly crumpled in his hands. "My dream family," it said in Lily's handwriting. He exhaled slowly. "It was never supposed to hurt her," he whispered, though no one was there to hear. When Daniel entered the study, Ethan barely looked up. Sir Daniel began cautiously, "I have just spoken to the staff. Miss Grace left early this morning. She packed her things and took the first bus to her hometown." Ethan's jaw tightened. Did she say anything? Only to tell us to take care of Lily, Daniel said softly, and that she was sorry for the trouble. Ethan's hands curled into fists. She has nothing to be sorry for. He stood abruptly and walked toward the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. For years he had thought that feelings were a weakness, that distance was a form of safety, but now the emptiness inside him felt unbearable. The next morning he sat at the kitchen table while Lily came in quietly, still in her pajamas. Her eyes were red from crying. She climbed onto the chair beside him and whispered, "Uncle Ethan, is Grace coming back?" He swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "I do not know, sweetheart." Lily pressed the drawing against her chest. She said, "Families do not leave." Ethan reached across the table, his voice breaking. "Then I will go bring her back." That afternoon, Ethan drove alone out of the city. The road wound through open fields and rain clouds gathered over the horizon. He followed the directions Daniel had found to a small town miles away. When he reached the address, he saw Grace sitting on the porch of a modest brick house, her hair tied back, her eyes tired but calm. She looked up as the car stopped. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan stepped out, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes. "Grace," he said quietly. She rose slowly. "Mr. Hale." "Ethan," he corrected. "Please. Just Ethan." Her voice trembled. "You should not be here. It will only make things harder." He shook his head. "You did nothing wrong." That moment at the gala, Lily's drawing, was never a mistake. "The only mistake was me letting you walk away." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she turned away. "You do not understand. People like me do not belong in your world. They will always see me as the nanny who overstepped." Ethan stepped closer. "Then let them see. I do not care what the world says anymore." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is not that simple." Ethan's shoulders sagged, the rain beginning to fall lightly between them. "Maybe not," he said, "but I cannot go back to the way things were. Lily cannot. I cannot." Grace blinked through her tears. For a long moment they stood in silence, the distance between them filled with everything unsaid. Finally she whispered, "You should go home." Ethan nodded slowly. "I will. But I hope one day home will not feel like home without you in it." He turned and walked back toward his car, the rain blurring his vision. Behind him, Grace stood still on the porch, her hands trembling, her heart torn between reason and the quiet truth she could no longer deny. 3 days later, the Hale mansion remained quiet, though the silence had changed. It was no longer just absence, it was waiting. Ethan spent his mornings at the Home Haven site, working harder than ever, yet every accomplishment felt hollow. He had tried calling Grace twice, but she never answered. The weight of those unanswered calls sat heavy on him each night. Lily was the only one who refused to give up. She drew pictures every day, each one showing the same 3 people holding hands. She taped them around the house, so that, as she said, Grace can find her way back if she ever forgets. That evening, Ethan sat in his study, staring at the framed copy of Lily's drawing that hung above the fireplace. The words "My Dream Family" glowed faintly under the lamplight. He took a deep breath and picked up his phone. This time, instead of calling, he began typing. "Grace, the gala hurt you, and I take full responsibility. I should have protected your name, not let others define it. I have spent my life hiding behind walls built from pride and fear. But you reminded me what it means to be human again. The Home Haven project will open this Saturday. It will bear your mark whether you are there or not. But if there is any part of you that still believes in us, please come." He sent the message before he could change his mind. On Saturday morning, the grand opening of Home Haven drew reporters, city officials, and dozens of children from nearby shelters. The building, once gray concrete, now shone with bright murals designs inspired by the very sketches Grace had encouraged the children to make. Ethan stood on stage, but his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance. Every sound made his heart jump. Daniel whispered, "Sir, we are ready for the ribbon cutting." Ethan nodded, gripping the scissors. He forced a smile, ready to go through the motions. But just as he began to speak into the microphone, a soft murmur swept through the crowd. Heads turned toward the doorway. Grace stood there, holding Lily's hand. She looked hesitant but calm, her eyes meeting his across the sea of people. Lily ran ahead, calling Uncle Ethan. She came back. The crowd broke into applause without knowing why. Ethan set the scissors down and stepped away from the podium. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke into the microphone again. "There is someone here who deserves this honor more than I ever could." He walked toward Grace, stopping just a few feet away. "This place exists because of your heart," he said. "You once told me that kindness leaves the biggest mark. You were right." Grace's eyes glistened. "You did not need to do this." "I needed to," he said quietly, "because I finally understand what home haven truly means." He turned to the crowd. "It means home is not built by wealth or titles. It is built by people who care enough to stay." The audience erupted in applause again, but for Ethan the world had gone silent. All he could see was Grace standing there in the morning light, the same calm presence that had changed everything. He reached out his hand. "Stay," he whispered. Grace hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. Lily clapped her hands joyfully. Ethan raised his voice one last time, smiling genuinely for the first time in years. "Welcome to Home Haven, a place built from love." The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, and somewhere above them, a single butterfly, half blue, half gold, drifted through the air, landing on the ribbon that had yet to be cut. It was as if even fate itself had chosen to bless the moment that brought them all home. The following morning, sunlight poured through the open windows of the Hale mansion. For the first time in a long time, the house felt whole again. Laughter floated from the kitchen, where Lily sat on the counter eating pancakes, her face dusted with flour. Grace stood beside her flipping another batch, while Ethan leaned against the doorway, coffee in hand, watching them both with a quiet smile. It had been only a day since the Home Haven opening, but the change was already visible. The headlines that once questioned his choices now praised the event as a story of redemption and compassion. Yet for Ethan, the real victory was not in the news, it was right here, in the simple sound of happiness returning to his home. Grace turned and caught him staring. "You should sit before your coffee gets cold," she said gently. He laughed softly and joined them at the table. Lily placed a pancake on his plate and said proudly, "I made that one. Grace showed me how." Ethan took a bite and nodded solemnly. "Then it is perfect." Lily giggled and threw her arms around both of them. "Now we really are a family, right?" Grace froze for a heartbeat, her eyes meeting Ethan's across the table. His gaze held hers steady, certain. "Yes," he said quietly. "We are." The day passed in the kind of peace that does not need words. In the afternoon they visited the Home Haven site again. Children were running through the gardens, their laughter echoing across the bright new courtyard. Grace watched as Lily played with them, her joy infectious. Ethan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his expression soft. "She is happy," Grace said. "She finally has a home that feels alive," Ethan replied. "We all do." Grace looked up at him. "I still do not know if I fit into your world, Ethan." He smiled faintly. "Then let us build a new one together." She hesitated, then nodded, the tension in her shoulders melting into relief. The wind lifted her hair as he reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining effortlessly, as if it had always been meant to happen. Months later, the Hale mansion hosted a small garden wedding. It was simple, quiet, and filled with people who had once been touched by Grace's kindness, teachers, children, volunteers, and the staff who had come to love her. Lily stood proudly as the flower girl scattering petals along the path. When Grace walked toward Ethan beneath the blooming archway, his eyes glistened. The man who had once believed in control and solitude now believed in something far greater, love that was humble, brave, and real. As they exchanged vows, the afternoon sun wrapped them in gold. Lily clapped her hands, shouting, "Now it is forever." Everyone laughed, and Ethan lifted Grace's hand to his lips. "She is right," he whispered. "Forever." Later that evening, after the guests had gone, the three of them sat together on the garden steps. The lights from the mansion glowed behind them, and the scent of roses filled the air. Grace leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, while Lily rested between them, half asleep. Ethan looked up at the stars and spoke softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Some mistakes are not mistakes at all. Sometimes they are just fate making sure we find our way." Grace smiled, eyes glistening. "The best mistake we ever made." He turned toward her, his voice a whisper. "And the only one I never want to undo." As the night deepened, the camera of the world would have seen nothing extraordinary, just three people sitting quietly under the stars. But for them, it was everything, proof that love once found through an innocent child's choice had become the very thing that bound their hearts forever.